In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia found itself at a crossroads. The country was faced with the monumental challenge of transitioning from a centralized, state run economy to a market based one. The Soviet economic system, which had been characterized by state ownership of almost all means of production, was no longer sustainable in the post Soviet world. What followed was one of the most controversial and pivotal moments in Russia's modern history: the privatization of state assets. Privatization in Russia during the 1990s was a complex, multifaceted process that involved the transfer of state owned industries to private hands. The goal was to stimulate economic growth by allowing market forces to shape the country's industries, while also reducing the state's control over the economy. However, the way in which this process unfolded has remained a source of intense debate, with some viewing it as a necessary step in Russia's transition to a market economy, and others seeing it as a blatant transfer of wealth to a small group of powerful oligarchs. Was privatization an essential reform, or was it a predatory grab for state assets by those who already held power in Russia? To answer this, it is essential to understand the economic and political context of Russia in the early 1990s. The economic collapse and the rise of privatization. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia was left with a deeply inefficient, state-controlled economy. The country faced extreme inflation, widespread shortages of goods, and a lack of basic economic infrastructure. The government had little control over its finances, and Russia's state-owned industries were operating at a loss. In order to stabilize the economy and transition to a market system, the Russian government, under President Boris Yeltsin, introduced a series of reforms, including the controversial privatization of state-owned enterprises. The privatization program, launched in the early 1990s, was framed as an essential step toward modernizing Russia's economy. The reformers, including economist Yegor Gaider and privatization architect Anatoly Chubais, argued that the state's control over the economy was stifling growth and innovation. By selling state-owned enterprises to private owners, they believed, Russia could unlock the potential of its industries and create a new class of entrepreneurs who would drive the country's economic recovery. This was the logic behind the privatization policies. In 1992, the government began the process of privatizing state-owned companies by distributing privatization vouchers to the population. These vouchers were essentially certificates that could be used by citizens to purchase shares in state-owned companies. The idea was that every Russian citizen would have a stake in the country's privatization process. However, this program, which was intended to give ordinary citizens access to the newly privatized industries, was plagued by inefficiencies and exploitation. The rise of the oligarchs. While many citizens received privatization vouchers, the process quickly became dominated by a small group of individuals who had the political connections and financial resources to acquire large stakes in Russia's most valuable industries. These individuals, who would later be known as the oligarchs, were able to accumulate significant wealth and power by purchasing state-owned assets at deeply discounted prices. The oligarchs were not only businessmen, but also individuals with close ties to the Russian government and political elites. In many cases, they used their connections to secure favorable deals and gain control over entire sectors of the economy. The most notorious example of this process was the privatization of Russia's oil and gas sector, which was dominated by a handful of businessmen who became some of the wealthiest people in the world. Individuals like Roman Abramovich, Boris Berezovsky, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky used their political ties to secure stakes in major industries, including oil, natural gas, and metals. These industries were among the most valuable state assets, and their privatization was critical to the creation of Russia's oligarchic system. The privatization process was marked by a lack of transparency and accountability. Privatization deals were often conducted behind closed doors, and many of the auctions that took place were rigged to benefit a small number of individuals. The rapid accumulation of wealth by the oligarchs created an economic and political imbalance, where a few individuals controlled vast portions of the country's resources, while the majority of the population remained impoverished. This inequality became one of the most significant social consequences of Russia's privatization. The role of corruption played a central role in the privatization process. As state assets were sold off, political elites and business leaders frequently used bribes and other illegal means to secure valuable assets for themselves. Many of the oligarchs had close ties to government officials, which allowed them to bypass regular legal procedures and obtain assets at a fraction of their true value. In some cases, the privatization of state-owned companies was done through sham auctions, where the winning bids were predetermined and the assets were sold at artificially low prices. A prominent example of this type of corruption was the loans for shares scheme of the late 1990s. Under this scheme, the Russian government auctioned off stakes in major state-owned companies in exchange for loans from private investors. However, these loans were often highly favorable to the oligarchs, allowing them to gain control of state assets without paying full market value. In many cases, the government's loans were never repaid, and the assets were effectively transferred to the oligarchs for free. This scheme is widely regarded as one of the most blatant examples of corruption during Russia's privatization. The impact of privatization on Russia's economy. The economic impact of privatization in Russia was complex and mixed. On one hand, privatization led to a significant increase in private sector investment and the creation of new businesses. Some industries, particularly those in the energy sector, saw an increase in efficiency and profitability as private owners took control of formerly state-run enterprises. Private ownership allowed businesses to modernize and expand, leading to the growth of Russia's wealthiest industries. However, the benefits of privatization were not evenly distributed. While some sectors became more efficient, others were devastated by the process. For example, many of Russia's heavy industries, such as steel and manufacturing, were sold off to a few select individuals, who often lacked the expertise or capital to run them effectively. As a result, these industries languished, and many workers lost their jobs. Moreover, the rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of a few oligarchs contributed to rising inequality and social unrest. The political consequences of privatization. Privatization in Russia also had significant political consequences. As the oligarchs gained control over the country's industries, they also gained control over the political system. The wealth and influence of the oligarchs allowed them to shape government policy in their favor, leading to a situation in which the state became increasingly subordinate to private interests. The political power of the oligarchs was particularly evident during the presidency of Boris Yeltsin, when many of the oligarchs played a key role in shaping government decisions and influencing the direction of Russian politics. The oligarchs' control over the media also played a central role in their ability to maintain political power. Many of Russia's major media outlets were owned by oligarchs, who used their control over the press to influence public opinion and protect their business interests. This led to a situation where political discourse was dominated by the interests of the wealthiest individuals, and dissenting voices were often silenced. The aftermath of privatization. The aftermath of Russia's privatization process has been felt in many ways. On one hand, privatization laid the groundwork for the growth of a private sector in Russia and the creation of powerful business elites. On the other hand, the process also created deep divisions in Russian society, as the wealth of the country became concentrated in the hands of a few powerful individuals, while the majority of the population saw little improvement in their standard of living. The legacy of privatization also has political implications. The oligarchs who emerged from the privatization process continue to wield significant influence in Russia, and their power is a key feature of the country's political landscape. In recent years, President Vladimir Putin has worked to consolidate power and bring the oligarchs under greater control. But the system of oligarchic rule that emerged during the 1990s remains an important part of Russia's political and economic system. Conclusion: privatization, necessary reform, or a power grab. The privatization of Russia in the 1990s remains one of the most controversial processes in the country's modern history. It was, in many ways, a necessary step in Russia's transition from a planned economy to a market economy. However, the way in which the process unfolded with the rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of a few powerful individuals and the widespread corruption that accompanied it, has left a lasting legacy of inequality and political dysfunction. Whether privatization was a necessary reform or a blatant power grab by the elite is still a matter of debate. What is clear is that the process fundamentally reshaped Russia's economy and political system, and the effects of privatization continue to shape the country to this day.